the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we actually jump into today's episode with Todd McGowan, we will be, just wanted to point out that I do have a Patreon, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm putting out, there is the ability to donate to that work. At the moment, I don't have the ability to put out premium episodes, but I do hope to someday, once we gain enough Patreon members, that will be kind of a valuable resource. So do consider that. You can find me at patreon.com/MUHH, which of course stands for Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. But I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Todd McGowan, a return guest, professor of English at the University of Vermont, co-host of the Y Theory podcast. Welcome back, Todd.
Hi, Cooper. Good to be back.
Absolutely. So just so you know, a couple of things, Todd. One, our prior episode on Lacan, my most listened to ever.
So that's great to hear.
Yeah, I got a lot of amazing feedback on that episode, being a pretty good sort of intro to Lacan. So just wanted to share that with you. I also have to share.
Excellent.
So I have some friends here, actually in Austin, believe it or not, that are in the process. You may not know this, but they're in the process of doing a pretty deep dive into your Capitalism and Desire book.
Oh wow! Yeah, I think I did know that. Right? Are they like Red Library?
Red Library, yeah, exactly.
Right.
Some friends of mine that I've met just actually through Twitter, believe it or not, but just wanted to call that out. So for listeners that haven't listened to that episode we did in the past, I was thinking the other day how funny it was, really funny for me, I think in particular, that you were at Texas State the year before I was and had just left. And the reason I think that's so interesting is because, I really didn't get exposed to psychoanalysis at all, really, until, just a few years ago. Or, I had Freud was somewhat referenced, right, during school, but not a whole lot, not like a deep dive understanding of psychoanalysis as a whole. So it really wasn't until the last maybe 2 to 3 years that that became a big interest of mine. And it's funny, the route that I took. So the actual replacement, or the person that replaced Todd at Texas State, is the one that actually introduced me to Baudrillard. So I remember her. Oh. She recommended 2 books to me because we were talking about Derrida, a little bit Foucault, in her class, and she mentioned you should read Simulacra and Simulation, and then 1,000 Plateaus. So I think that's kind of funny to come back full circle. What would my academic or my theory interest be if I had the chance to take your class?
Right. That's a great question. I mean, maybe you'd be the opposite. Maybe you'd be a total Deleuzian, right?
I know, right? Yeah.
Right.
But my first question, Todd, given the state of the world and being hemmed up indoors, so to speak, have you been giving any ground relative to desire lately?
I don't think so. No, I've just been reading a lot of books.
Right.
Yeah. The one thing, I guess, the one way I have is I haven't written that much. I've been kind of pouring through Murakami novels. And so for me, novels are kind of giving ground relative to my desire because I have to sort of force myself to read them. So I haven't been reading Hegel. I've been reading novels. And so that's I'm seeding my desire in that way.
What Murakami pieces are you looking at?
I reread Wild Sheep Chase, which I think is amazing, and then I just read Killing Commendatore, which is his not his most recent one, but yeah, I think it is his most recent one, and I thought that was pretty good. So.
And now, is this just for fun, or is this a project you may?
No, just for fun. It's hard for me not to turn it into a project, but right. I part of the thing is I don't know Japanese, so it ensures that it won't be a project because it's, it's kind of hard to talk about a novelist, especially in translation. So
very true, very true. Yeah. So myself, I've mostly been reading theory. I mean, the podcast keeps me pretty busy. One of the big projects that I've been undertaking is I'm doing a series with a couple of friends of mine on Guattari's The Machinic Unconscious. And so we're going through that chapter by chapter. And then the chorus, it was published right around the same time as 1,000 Plateaus. So there's a lot of content overlap. So we're covering kind of the corresponding chapters in 1,000 Plateaus. But that's extremely challenging reading. In the midst of that, I read Symbolic and Exchange and Death from Baudrillard, and that seemed very easy in comparison.
Right, for sure.
Which I found pretty funny. After I remember reading a review of the book, they were saying how much difficulty they were having, but I was like, oh wow, this seemed incredibly easy in comparison.
Right. Compared to Guattari, for sure.
Absolutely. But to get into the meat of the discussion, and the reason why I've asked you back is to delve into and maybe give us, I don't know, we can do maybe a 101 delve into Hegelian dialectics. It's something that comes up frequently. So I have a Discord for the podcast, and we have a couple of huge Hegel fans, and then we have a lot of Deleuzians, fans of Deleuze, and I'm kind of situated. I think I kind of lean a little bit more to Deleuze on things, but I'm curious about Hegel. Sounds really interesting. I don't know a lot about dialectics, to be honest, so I'm really excited to learn a little bit. So I don't know where the easiest entry point would be. Would that be just to bring up contradiction, or what do you think?
Yeah, sure. So I think that Hegel's philosophy is really a philosophy of contradiction, and that dialectics is about seeking out, or rather uncovering, the contradictions that inhabit both language and our daily interactions. So it's really a philosophy of the dialectics. For Hegel is a philosophy of contradiction, understanding, grasping contradiction, and then reconciling ourselves to it. So it's important, I think often Hegelian dialectics gets described as overcoming contradiction, but I think that's absolutely incorrect, that it's much more something like reconciling ourselves to the inevitability of contradiction and the impossibility of overcoming it. So I think that's a crucial part of Hegel's philosophy that has been, I would say, missed by a lot of readers of Hegel.
In terms of your interest, was Hegel first, or was Lacan first, in terms of kind of what you became interested in? Or so
that's a good question. Interestingly, initially they were entirely separate. So I, on the one hand, read a little psychoanalysis, and on the other hand, I read Hegel. Hegel was much more important to me, and it was only when I encountered Slavoj Žižek that I could see the way in which they converged. I couldn't even, to be honest, I didn't see the convergence before it was pointed out by Slavoj. So it wasn't like, I had this intuition or whatever. No, I didn't have that at all. To me, I didn't see any psychoanalytic dimension to Hegel's thought until I encountered Sublime Objective Ideology, and then it's one of those things where once it becomes apparent, you can't but see it all the time. So now it's perfectly. I think it's almost impossible to miss. Whereas before I missed it. So it's a testament, I think, to the importance of Slavoj's intervention.
I do admit to I think one of the things that I found most alluring about Lacan is that sort of contradiction in his work. And I've I don't know. I seem to, I've enjoyed it more when Lacan does it than Hegel. I don't think that I'm being fair to Hegel when I see people kind of, the Hegelians coming after me. I'm a little bit more defensive and skeptical. And so hopefully we'll work through that today in this discussion. I think.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Before we really delve into the discussion here, do you have any recommendations on if someone's curious, I guess, an intro to dialectics or Hegel other than the phenomenology, or if there's maybe a chapter of the phenomenology or that you would recommend taking a look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best intro text for Hegel is the encyclopedic logic. It's often called the lesser logic. It gets much clearer than the phenomenology. I think you cannot get through the phenomenology without an abundance of help. Like I've never had a student read it on their own. They've all done independent studies with me, or I've taught it. I think I've taught it in 3 different classes, and that's the only book. That was the book of the class, right? So,
Gotcha.
but I think encyclopedic logic, I think you can get through it, and it's not that bad. And especially the first 100 pages, it kind of lays out nicely what Hegel's philosophy is. I would also say the preface, or I don't know if it's called preface or introduction to the philosophy of history, that's pretty good as well. So the philosophy of history comes in 3 volumes, and it comes at, obviously, stupid thing to say, but it comes at the beginning. And it's before, so the first volume of the history of philosophy is not so interesting because it's about philosophers up to Plato. But the preface to that's, again, about 100 pages, and it's really, really, it's one of the nicest, cleanest explanations of dialectics that I think Hegel has. So if you just wanted to read that introduction, and then I think the encyclopedic logic is also really good.
I was delving into the preface for the phenomenology, and I come across a passage that I wanted to read, and I thought this kind of got towards a little bit of, I don't know, this felt very like a good encapsulation of Hegel's dialectics, but also felt it spoke to the moment that we're existing in. So I'm going to go ahead and read this if you'll indulge me.
Okay.
Besides, it is not difficult to see that ours is a birth time and a period of transition to a new era. Spirit has broken with the world it was hitherto inhabited and imagined, and is of a mind to submerge it in the past, and in the labor of its own transformation. Spirit is indeed never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward. And I think that last sentence here, spirit is never at rest, but always engaged in moving forward, I think goes to how Hegel sees dialectics functioning, or uses dialectics, I might say.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's a beautiful passage, really. Yeah, I think that the preface to the phenomenology is the most readable part of it, and it's also a pretty good introduction to his thought, I think. I just think that the problem is after you get past the preface, it gets appreciably harder. But yeah, I think like that idea that, I mean, his notion of spirit is that it's a very distinct idea. So it's the German word is Geist. And so what's interesting is that's been translated, the first translation of Hegel into English translated as phenomenology of mind. So spirit and mind. So, and I think while that's incorrect, it's also helpful as a way to think about what spirit might mean for him,
right.
That it means it's something like our collective mind, right? Our collective way of thinking. And so for him, that spirit is really, it's necessarily wrapped up in dialectics. Like spirit is always, as that passage you said suggests, it's always in movement, and it's always struggling also. It's never reaches a point of rest where it can just be content with itself. So that's an important aspect of Hegel's dialectics, which again, I think is missed in this notion of synthesis that often gets attributed to him.
What do you consider dialectics to be? I guess it's often considered a method. Do you feel that's a pretty accurate way to look at it?
It is certainly a method, but I think it's more than that, because I think it's also existential, right? Like dialectics is, I think it's tied to the very nature of our existence. And it's because, and Hegel deduces this from the nature of language and symbolic interactions, that it must be the case, if that's possible, if that is, if language is possible and language is always contradictory, then being itself, he makes an ontological claim on that basis, that being itself must hence be contradictory. And so the dialectics is like being itself, ontology, and it's not just this method that one uses to make sense of things. It's actually part of the nature of things, that things are dialectical for Hegel.
So is that sort of a capital T or a lowercase t form of truth, or is that too bold of a claim?
I think that's right. No, I think that's right. I think it's, I mean, it wouldn't, I think it's, is dialectics truth? I mean, that's a good question. I don't think that's too big of a claim. I think it's I would say it this way, rather. I would say dialectics is the pathway to truth. Like it is that it is the way in which truths are uncovered, because Hegel's point is that truth always has to emerge first in the form of the fiction. So this is a very Lacanian, Lacan takes this up the same idea. And he even says, I think this is an actual Lacanian aphorism, that truth has the structure of a fiction. Hegel says something pretty similar. And so it's dialectics which gets us from some initial fiction to truth as something that we can discover.
On that note of fiction,
by understanding the contradictions that are, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say on that note of fiction, I was just going to say, you pointed out that sort of crude dialectical, I think, understanding that most people have is the antithesis, thesis, synthesis, right? Which I think it was Fichte that actually first crafted that sort of formulation. But
exactly,
that's not exactly how dialectics works. That's a sort of a misnomer, misunderstanding of the process, right?
Absolutely. And so if you read Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, which is translated very badly as science of knowledge, but if you read that book, he uses that formulation, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, all the time. Like it's maybe on every other page. He doesn't say it's dialectical, though. That's interesting. So Hegel's idea of dialectics, so Hegel never uses those terms, never. So that's important. But Hegel's idea of dialectics really comes not from Plato, where you might think it comes from, but more from Kant. And so the last part of the critique of pure reason is called the transcendental dialectic. And what Kant does is use dialect. For him, dialectic is only negative. It only means we follow reason to these points at which it contradicts itself. So we know that we've overstepped the bounds of what we're permitted to think.
I see.
And so for Hegel, that dialectical result that Kant sees as purely negative, for Hegel, it's also positive. That when we run into contradictions, that doesn't tell us that we don't know anything. That's a way of actually knowing something, Hegel thinks. That understanding contradiction as an end point of thought is itself an insight. So you might say that the only difference between Kant and Hegel is just the flipping of the way he values that endpoint. Like, is it just a negative, as it is for Kant, or is there some positive insight there, as there is for Hegel? So this is why Kant really thinks that reason, he gives reason a very limited role in his philosophy. It's only really about marking the limits of our possibility for thinking. Whereas for Hegel, reason is about is the vehicle through which we can recognize contradiction. And so it's funny, the contradictions that Kant thinks are the end point, Hegel thinks that's really that's what reason gives us, and we should celebrate that.
Interesting. That's funny, though. I guess it does make sense, being them both being German idealists. I got a very much like reading the preface or the phenomenology, very much reminding me of Kant, whom I have often bemoaned as very boring reading. Probably unfairly.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say also, I don't know if you've heard this argument, but I've heard the argument too, and it maybe speaks to the portion of the Critique of Pure Reason that you brought up about Kant being sort of a proto-post-structuralist in some ways, kind of setting the table for that. And I want to say that it's tied to the exact thing that you brought up, the chapter that you brought up, but I may be misremembering.
No, I think that's probably right. I mean, if figures like Derrida, they're much more Kantian than they are Hegelian because they're concerned with the limit on what it's possible to say or do, right? So they're figures of the limit, and that's really Kant's philosophy. It's a philosophy of the limit. Whereas for Hegel, he has this famous saying, it's a critique of Kant, where he says, you only know a limit once you've already gone beyond it. So for Hegel, there's no real such thing as limits on the possibility of thought. It's through going beyond those limits that we really discover what we think. So
I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah. I think it's pretty great.
That's so great. I mean, I think that whatever that contradiction is, or that kind of shift at looking at things, is so fascinating to me. I love that. I don't know, that excites me. That gets my neurons all all jazzed up.
Yeah. I think it's really one of those amazing points in the history of human thought, that where this thing that was for up until this point a dead end, all of a sudden becomes, well, wait a minute, we can look at that in a whole other way, and the valence of it completely changes.
So to give this this idea of, I guess, dialectical tension of contradiction some material or a way to think of it materially, one that I thought of that I've really I don't know, I get a kick out of this too, is that idea of, so, personal finance, and especially, this is what millennials have been criticized for, is, not buying homes because they're spending all their money at Starbucks and on avocado toast. And I think it's very funny that this contradiction within capital of at the personal level, on the individual level, there's an austerity that one must, go by and live by.
Right.
But
right.
Systematically, as part of the whole, if everyone was living that austere lifestyle, then the system would sort of collapse.
Crash.
Like if everybody was actually doing what they quote unquote should be doing, the system is unsustainable. And I think that goes to the type of contradiction that Hegelian dialectics are trying to get at and understand. Am I on the right track?
No, absolutely. That's a perfect one. Yeah. Capitalism is the contradiction. I mean, that's the perfect contradiction of capitalism. The other form of that is that the employer wants to pay the employee the smallest wage, the lowest wage possible. Right. But they need employees to make enough money that they can buy the crap that they're making. So they're this double bind where they want every other employer to pay their employees a lot so that they can buy their stuff, right? So that's another perfect contradiction identified by Marx, right? So I think that there's this Hegelian approach that then Marx takes up and brings to economy, which I think is pretty important. Like Hegel doesn't really, for all of his greatness, like I think he's a great thinker, but he has no real understanding of modern capitalist economy. I mean, he has a couple of little things where he says something kind of like what you were saying, where he says the more society becomes rich, the more it will produce an impoverished class. Ooh, that's pretty good, and that's pretty much about capitalist society. But he really doesn't understand the factory system or anything. So he just, and part of it is when he would live. So he dies in 1831. But part of it is Germany was very behind the times, and it's really only Marx going to England that allows him to write Capital, and he can see the modern factory system working.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense because let's see, Hegel was in the Prussia was its own state at that point. Whenever he was working, correct. Okay, right. That makes complete sense. Yeah. So I've been a bit skeptical of Hegel and dialectics as someone, I think, I'm very much, I do enjoy my post-structuralist thinkers quite a bit, and see dialectics having the potential to be just another meta-narrative. What would you say to that argument? Does that have any merit, or?
Well, I mean, I guess. I mean, I think it is it a meta narrative. I would just say it's not a narrative at all, because it's I think you'd almost see it almost opposite. It's the dismantling of every narrative. It's the way, like, dialectics is about the way in which every narrative that is teleological ends up undermining itself. So and this is why it can be really hard to read Hegel, because he doesn't take his own position and then advance it in the book. Instead, he takes what he thinks is, well, he begins every book with what he calls the immediate or commonsensical position, and then works through that to what he calls the absolute. So the movement is all driven by the forms, the positions themselves, and the way in which they undermine themselves. So it's not a narrative that you impose, it's what you find within a position, and the way in which its underlying implicit arguments end up coming into contradiction with themselves, and then thereby leading to another different position. So I think that its structure is opposed to narrative, or is an anti-narrative. So I don't think it can function. I mean, I think, ironically, for Stalin, and I think for a certain brand of Marxism, dialectic does become this master narrative that gets imposed on the world. But I think that's a betrayal of the way in which Hegel, at least, understands dialectics.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so that makes sense, because I guess the arguments that or the tension that I've come across is more so with Marxists, and not even going for like dialectical materialism, but even using Hegelian dialectics as sort of this way that the communist state, or the party, would usher in communism through just this continued dialectical process.
Right.
Which I always felt like there was an implied teleology to, and I don't know. It sounds like that's not, Hegel doesn't really believe in a teleological process.
I mean, he's right, because so Spinoza, he's at least enough of a follower of Spinoza to know that teleology is like in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics. You probably noticed that Spinoza famously undermines all teleology and says it's just a projection of our own, the way in which we think, onto other phenomena.
Okay.
And Hegel definitely bought that, and so he's not a teleological thinker, I don't think, at all, except in this one way. I think he is, that he thinks that if you follow contradiction to its endpoint, you're always going to get to this. You're never going to resolve it. So This inability to resolve contradiction, if you see that as an end, as teleological, then he always thinks we're going to end up with that. So
Gotcha.
So in that sense, but of course that means a kind of openness. So I would be loath to call that teleology, but I think I could see how someone would see it that way.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. And so I think maybe it's probably a misunderstanding on my part, probably looking at that very, I think, crude form of dialect, like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because it's sort of like, to me, I was sort of formulating this as, okay, I'm doing dialectics, for lack of a better phrase, and whatever the contradiction that I'm looking at, or that relationship, is in itself subjective. So that's kind of made me a bit skeptical of, okay, this is sort of like, okay, you can look back at history and you can see, okay, there was this part of the contradiction, the other side of that, here's how it played out. It's sort of like a post hoc, it felt kind of like a post hoc rationalization, so to speak.
Right.
And I don't know, maybe that's a misunderstanding of Hegel, but I'm also curious, as part of that too, I think a big thing is, how does time function for Hegel? That's something that I've been immensely curious about, because I think it is tied to that notion of looking at relationships, how like only at the end of something can you see the the
Right.
contradictions clearly. I guess not always, because we're within capital and we can recognize that, avocado toast versus, personal austerity.
Right. But I think you are onto something important, that this idea of retroactivity is crucial for Hegel. So the term, Freud uses the term, and I think this term is applicable back onto Hegel, who doesn't necessarily use it. The German word is Nachträglichkeit, which means like something causes itself, something in the future causes something in the past. So it's like an after effect.
Right.
So this retroactivity, Hegel does think that is the way that time functions. So that we, in other words, we come to a certain point, and then when we come to that point, we posit our own causes that then get us to that point. So it's an interesting way of, I think, thinking about causality, not in terms of chronological temporality,
right? Okay.
Right? So when something happens that is disruptive, is a rupture, there's no prelude to it. Like, it just comes, and we find the cause only after the fact, and we look back and say, oh, it must have been this that caused that. But it's really, Hegel's idea is really, no, there are these ruptures that occur that actually are almost like breaks in the fabric of time, right? So that something new emerges that doesn't have any preconditions for it. It emerges contingently. And then afterwards, we look back and we attribute a causality to that. So that's the way in which that idea, what you're talking about, is present in Hegel's thought, for sure. And he sees that as the part of this, the way that we make sense of history, and also the way in which we minimize the radicality of the breaks that take place in history.
I'm beginning to see the appeal of Hegel to Lacan. It was a little bit cloudy, but I think that your last little bit there really kind of clarified that Hegel is a lot more concerned with consciousness than I had ever imagined, I think.
Right.
Which I think was interesting. And I guess that's, to me, I feel like that's probably what drew Lacan into Hegel to begin with.
I think so, although I think that what's interesting about Lacan is so early on, he studied under Alexander Kojève, who was the great French. He wasn't French, great Hegelian in France. He's Russian. And he studied under him for 3 or 4 years in the 30s, when Kojève gave these great lectures that all these important French intellectuals came to. And so his early thought, Lacan's, is very explicitly Hegelian, although the problem is it's tempered through this Kojèvian understanding of Hegel, which takes the master-slave dialectic as the absolute matrix for all of Hegel's thought, and really also foregrounds this idea of the end of history. In fact, some people have said that the end of history is just Kojève's concept that he invents, and it has nothing to do with Hegel at all. I don't necessarily think that, but so the point is that Lacan has a very Kojèvian Hegel at work through his early thought, and it's only when he imagines that he's breaking from Hegel that he starts to really become Hegelian. So it's a kind of nice irony that so this happens about, I don't know, seminar 10, seminar 11. So in the mid 1960s.
What do you think of this idea? So, being very immersed in language, and I think semiotics. How much of dialectics do you think is just I guess you kind of already got to this, because it's part of consciousness, which is tied to language. So the idea of like the subject predicate distinction being like, is that a material basis for dialectics, or is that an expression of is that an expression of dialectics materially? Is that we structure our sentences that way because of the contradictions within language, or is it the other way around? I don't know. It's a
great question, but I think it's both. Like we we
Okay.
discover dialectics through language. I've always found it hard to believe that that Hegel did not have knowledge of modern linguistics. Because if you read the sense certainty section of the Phenomenology, it really reads like someone who's read Saussure and Jakobson. So it's really like so he really is getting dialectics from the structure of language. But so in terms of our apprehension of it, we get it from language. But then he says it must be the case that the world had to be in such a way that we could produce language that's
Right.
dialectical. So
Okay.
so his idea is that, and I think this is, I think a lot of Hegelians find this questionable. Like they think that all Hegel's talk, that we can only think about Hegel in terms of the social symbolic structure, where we cannot make any kind of ontological claims, and the ones that he made are dubious. But I think I think this idea, I find it pretty convincing that there must be a certain ontological structure in being to make contradiction in language possible. So being, in other words, to put it in terms of other psychoanalytic thinkers have put it, being can't be one. Like being can't be like Parmenides thinks. It can't all be one, or else how could we ever have even started to speak at all and break up the oneness? Like if the contradictions of being are just a fact of our subjectivity, how could that be? How could they ever emerge unless there's some contradiction within being itself? And that, I think, is the most radical dimension of Hegel's thought, that we can trace the logic back from our symbolic structure, the structure of language, back to the precondition in being that makes it possible.
What does that look like as is that that sounds like it's a bit in opposition to Spinoza. Am I right, or?
No, I think you're right, because so Spinoza thinks there's only one substance, right? So there's only all being is one. And so Hegel's point is exactly the opposite. He has this great line in the preface to Phenomenology where he says, substance must be considered as subject. So what he means by that is that everything that we consider as substantial, that is as undivided, has to be thought of as subject, i.e. as divided. So there is, for Hegel, there's no undivided substance, which separates him from every thinker prior to him, really, because every thinker prior to Hegel believed there was at least something. Like for Leibniz, the undivided substance was the monad. For Spinoza, it was simply everything was the undivided substance. For Hegel, there's no undivided substance. There's nothing that escapes self-division, contradiction, and subjectivity. So even though obviously an apple is not a subject, an apple is still, for Hegel, divided in the sense that it can be eaten, right? Like he thinks that the very fact we know an apple isn't a substance because we can take a bite out of it. Like we can, the ability of the whole, of everything and it's amazing, I think, that he didn't know modern physics, because I think modern physics confirms exactly what he says, which is why I mentioned Slavoj Žižek earlier. He loves to talk about physics in terms of Hegel, because it does seem that the truths of quantum physics nicely line up with things that Hegel himself thinks about the way in which things relate to each other, and the final self-division of everything all the way down to the atomic level.
I forgot to bring up this point when we were discussing sort of Hegel and time, but it's Nick Land actually has a similar concept called templexity that is operating like on a different level, where, like you're saying, things in the future can cause the past, because there is no, like, this notion of linear time isn't really how the universe operates. It's just our subjectivity that is kind of creating that illusion. But I know I found that just to be an interesting sort of
I think that's a nice Hegelian idea.
Overlap between those two concepts. That immediately struck me. Something else. This is kind of miscellaneous, but I had a sociology degree as an undergrad, And some of the aspects of Hegel I felt very much applied to Emil Durkheim to a degree, and like in particular this notion of social deviance.
Right.
And so Durkheim's notion was that, okay, deviance is never, and much like contradiction, it's not something that we can ever escape, because we will simply redefine what deviance is throughout over time. And it
absolutely.
And it having sort of that a functional aspect to it, rather than being a dysfunction, which is, I think, the common sense understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that for Hegel, the law itself, or the social regulation, necessarily produces deviance, right? Like, what seems like it is a rejection of the social order actually is part of its functioning for Hegel.
Creating a more bond.
And he even goes further, because he also...
Go ahead. Sorry.
Right, exactly. And it also, what's interesting is he also thinks that the punishment that a criminal experiences is actually part of the crime itself. And this is something, he takes this from Kant too. This is also Kant's idea that we shouldn't think of punishment as external to the crime, something imposed upon the criminal or on the crime. Instead, he says it's posited by the criminal act itself, so that the criminal acts in such a way that the punishment is actually included in the criminal act. So I think that's an interesting, and it's tied to this notion of the necessity of deviance, that I think that he sees the way in which it's what seems like it doesn't fit in and is actually contradictory, that contradiction is necessary actually,
right?
To the functioning of the social order. Yeah.
And I've always thought that very interesting, as I'm some kind of anarchist, I think. And so realizing that, okay, so there is no teleology to this, and there will continue to be contradiction. There will continue to be, I guess, strife after some like revolution in quotes, right?
Right, but this is why you can't be Hegelian. I think he was he's very anti-anarchy. He was he's very strictly, he wasn't necessarily all about obedience to the law, but he thought the law was absolutely constitutive for subjectivity. So he didn't think that there was any kind subjectivity outside the law.
That's very interesting. Because one thing, a feeling, I don't know, it's kind of a gut feeling that I get, having been raised in a kind of evangelical environment as a kid, is Hegel oftentimes reminds me very much of that sort of Christianity. For some reason, I don't know exactly what it is. Maybe I've taken the idea of idealism too far, right, and judged him too harshly in that term. But I don't know. What do you think? Do you see a relationship there at all, or am I just?
No. I mean, there's for sure a relationship between Hegel and Christianity. I think he's in a certain way the great Christian philosopher, because his whole point is that Christianity apprehends something that philosophy also apprehends. That is that the absolute, it brings the absolute. So the absolute as God is posited as far in the distance, right? We can never, it's transcendent. We can't have in fact, if you're Jewish, you can't even write God's name out, right? So his idea is that Christianity brings the absolute down to earth. And he loves that idea, that actually and it does that because it recognizes that it creates the idea of a loving God, which means he thinks a God that's divided and contradictory, because you can only be loving insofar as you're lacking. So Christianity creates a lacking God that then comes down to earth in the form of Christ, and then that eliminates the God of the beyond. So I think there's a way in which he's very, very, very Christian, except, now I'm going to add the next part, is that I think it's absolutely opposed to the way that contemporary evangelical Christians conceive of Christianity, because they want to sustain the God of the beyond as an authority.
Yes.
Like, we don't know, all we can do is obey.
Right.
We have to look to God, God only. like for Hegel, you're never allowed to say God only knows, right? Because God doesn't know any better than we do. So,
oh, that's brilliant.
So, or you have to say God has no idea. Then you're more on the proper Hegelian ground. So,
that's delightful. That's really good.
Yeah.
To that point, I think it's interesting for me. I think maybe that's my instinct was based on that. I'm, maybe like mixing the sort of modern notion of like the evangelical view versus what Hegel was kind of positing. But I have found recently, and primarily exposure to Spinoza as a way to understand Deleuze a bit better, but as sort of an agnostic atheist type, whatever, label you want to throw on it. I do find Spinoza's idea it is a very much more comforting notion of the universe, I think, than I think other humanist currents. And I've found that I've really enjoyed that kind of notion of everything being one substance, and then the expressions and the modes of expression and so forth.
Right.
We talked a little bit about Hegel and Spinoza. Do you have any further point of view as far as those two thinkers are concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's interesting because Heinrich Heine said he read his copy of the Phenomenology. He's like, well, Spinoza already said all this. So I think there's a way in which, I don't think that's right, but I think there's a way in which they're very, very linked together. And it's just, I think you could almost read Hegel just in this way. He adds to Spinoza just the concept of subject. And that's it. But there's a lot of implications along with that, right? Like that means that all of a sudden everything is, if subjectivity means self-division, then that oneness of substance is no longer a oneness. It's more that we're all connected by our self-division, not by this overarching oneness. So that's the difference, I think, between Hegel and Spinoza. They both think about the whole. Hegel definitely thinks we have to have recourse to the whole. But for Hegel, the thing that constitutes the whole is the self-division of everyone. So the fact that everyone is connected through their inability to connect with themselves. So I reach out to you, you reach out to me because we miss ourselves. So that's the Hegelian idea. And I think for Spinoza, we're intrinsically connected because we're all part of the one. So I think I think there are political implications of that difference. Pierre Maucheret, he wrote a book called Hegel, or Spinoza ou Hegel, like Spinoza or Hegel. And I think there's a lot that's really a dividing ground, like the choice between Deleuze and Hegel, which I think is a genuine alternative, is I think in some ways the distinction between Spinoza and Hegel as well. So I think those are the two basic positions. Like, do you either accept the oneness of the whole, or do you think that the whole is constantly riven by contradiction? And I think it seems to me like that's the basic opposition between two possibilities for thought. And we see like the main proponents of the Spinozist view today are something like Hart and Negri, right? Like their whole empire, the multitude project is about a Deleuzian, Spinozian vision of things. And then the other side would be Zizek, Badiou, this kind of idea of the notion of the split being in some way essential.
Interesting. I do want to get to Deleuze a bit further, but first I wanted to ask, do you have an opinion on Stirner at all and his relationship to dialectics and Hegel?
Yeah, I think Stirner's an interesting figure. I mean, he's classified as a young Hegelian, right, and a left Hegelian, in the same way that Marx was. He's trying to. I think this is my criticism of all young Hegelians, that I think they don't see the way in which there already is this space for the individual within Hegel's own dialectic, and they try to. Their critique. Most of them, their critique is they both want to politicize. They think they can make political Hegel more of or Hegelian thought or dialectics more leftist, and they think that they can make it more applicable to give the individual some space within the dialectical system. And my only point would be, I think that's already apparent in Hegel. And then I think the attempt to forge that space for individuality ends up, I think you miss the way that contradiction is universal, and that individual gets accepted from contradiction in the case of Stirner, I think.
Interesting. So Stirner is someone very influential on me, because I have this kind of, I don't know, he's even as well, which kind of makes sense. I see him as very much a sort of proto-post-structuralist as well.
Well, right. I mean, Derrida, I think, really thinks a lot of him. He mentions him in Spectres of Marx,
right,
and sees him as he makes fun of Marx as making fun of Stirner in that Herculean-sized chapter of German ideology, right? Which is I think Derrida says he keeps hammering nails in Stirner's coffin, and none are ever enough, right? Like it's.
But Stirner has actually, I guess, honestly, it's probably through memes on the online he's like one of the biggest meme philosophers in sort of if you're
That's
looking
interesting.
Right, on sort of like the left end of Twitter or even Facebook, or really just online in general. So it's kind of amusing. But I do think he does.
He's definitely more memed than read, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. But he is very influential in certain strains of anarchism, post-left and like post-anarchism. And I thought it was very interesting to see his connection of his ideas to even almost sort of a parallel project to Derrida in some ways, in sort of in his just sort of relentless attack of liberal idealism and and the spooks or the spirits or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But again, Stirner, and I don't think he ever mentions dialectics whatsoever in the what is it, the
ego in his own,
or the unique in its property, I
right.
think is the better translation, they say.
Right.
But I think that even ties into that contradiction between Spinoza and Hegel too, because Stirner says that there's only individual, or everything is unique, or every being is unique, or something like along those lines. I mean, that's oversimplifying it, I think. But.
No, I think that's right. I think that's his position. And I see, again, this is a point where I think, Hegel's notion of singularity, I think, articulates kind of the same thing. So It's interesting, because I think this is true a lot of times with Marx, like they launch a critique that doesn't see the way in which Hegel's already kind of said what they're trying to say that he should say, So
would that be the origin of this common refrain that Hegel is inescapable, or I forget, we can never escape Hegel?
Yeah, who says that? I think Derrida says that. And I think that's, I don't know I don't think that's true, because Deleuze certainly escapes him, right? Like Deleuze is openly anti-Hegelian, and I think it's right. As I said before, I think it's just, there are these certain things that I think come down to just a philosophical choice, and for whatever reason you make it. And I think the distinction between Deleuze and Hegel is one of those. I have friends of mine who try to bring Deleuze, like Slavoj has a book, it's called something, what is it called? Organs Without Bodies, right? Like it's an attempt to bring Deleuze into the Hegelian camp, but it just doesn't. That's a nice book on Hegel, but it's not a book on Deleuze. So I think that sometimes there are just opposition. There are just things that you can take one side or the other, but you can't really marry them. And my sense is that that's true about Deleuze and Hegel.
Interesting. You anticipated my next question, which would be if Deleuze really escaped Hegel, and you, I think, very firmly agree that there is an escape. Although I do want to bring up this passage that I stumbled upon in my work for my Guattari series. That I thought was interesting. This is from A Thousand Plateaus, and I'm questioning whether Deleuze really does escape Hegel here.
Okay.
Because he says, or Guattari, and he say, in a sense, everything we attribute to an age was already present in the preceding age. forces, for example, it has always been a question of forces designated either as forces of chaos or forces of the earth, right? And that seems to me on its face to be extremely Hegelian.
Yeah, I guess, but I mean, but don't you think? I guess here's why I said what I said. I would say his notion of difference is fundamentally different from the notion of contradiction, and I don't think that like for Deleuze, differences are, and they don't really relate to each other. So things in Kant, and he's on this idea, he's indebted to both, interestingly, to both Leibniz and Spinoza, who seem like they're at counter currents, right? Like, because one is about all the absolute isolation of everything, Leibniz, and then Spinoza is about the oneness. But I think Deleuze brings them together, and in his notion of difference, and difference is absolutely distinct from other things, but it doesn't relate to those other things. Like the difference of an entity is not constituted through its relation to another entity, which for Hegel, it has to be. And that's why he thinks there are no different, like for Hegel, we can reduce all differences to contradictions. And for Deleuze, we can reduce all contradictions to difference. So I think and I don't see how you can bring those two together. But I do see how they both function.
Right.
And I'm not even sure, you know how most of the time in which you describe a argument, you're already taking one side in it, right? Like, right. But I don't think that a Deleuzean would be that upset with how I just described that. Like, I think they would accept that for Deleuze, we can look at every apparent contradiction and see really there's a functioning of difference there. And I think, I know Hegel would say, when we see differences, there's really contradictions at work.
Interesting. So yeah, I kind of had intuited that that maybe these viewpoints are simply saying they're saying the same thing, but from a different vantage point or something like that. But
I think that's right. No, Cooper, I think you're right. I think that's the right way to say it. That they and that vantage point is everything, right? Like, that it means everything because it determines how you're going to look at what you see, and how are you going to look at it and say that what seems like it's something relational is actually just is a collision. So things that exist as differences, they collide for Deleuze. And so for, Deleuze, like, let's take death, for example. So Deleuze thinks death is the result of what he calls a bad encounter, right? Like, it's just, you have your own way of being, and then you encounter some bad thing, the thing that doesn't agree with you, like COVID, and you're dead. Now, for Hegel, he thinks everything dies of its own account, right? Like, that is radically different. So Hegel thinks even if I get shot walking down the street, I in some way have my own death already in me because I'm a dying being.
Right.
So
okay.
that dying is already part of me, even if the time at which it happens to be contingent, right? Like, it's most of the time going to be contingent. But that dying still has to be part of me, or I can't die.
Yeah.
Right.
I love that. That's so good. I mean, I'm absolutely loving this, but I enjoy both thinkers. I'm just someone, I think, that's just interested in this, like, these questions. This is the most fascinating thing you can kind of get to here. And I think it's an interesting, actually, like, the dialectic between Hegel and Deleuze itself is an interesting one. I think that'd be interesting to really dive into. But for someone should write a book on the dialectic of Deleuze and Hegel. Right. That would be interesting. Yeah. What's the synthesis, or how are their failures united into something new? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Yeah.
I've sort of run out of my questions in terms of Hegel and dialectics. Is there anything that I have missed, or you think is important that we haven't already sort of tilled through the ground of?
Well, I would just say this one thing that Hegel's philosophy always, I mentioned it in passing, it always ends up with the absolute, either absolute knowing, absolute idea, absolute political form. And I think for him, what absolute means, and I think this is very important, is it means how you are, means to be absolutely reconciled with contradiction. So absolute is not, I mean, I've said this in a variety of ways, but I just want to clarify in terms of the absolute. It's not the overcoming of contradiction. It's rather the recognition that contradiction itself is absolute. So you could say, you might retitle it as absolute contradiction. Like that's the end point of Hegel's philosophy in every one of his books, I think.
Yeah. Even just thinking about that, what you just said, and Deleuze's multiplicity of difference, I don't know, that actually, they seem kind of aligned in, when you think of it that way.
Right. I mean,
maybe just on the surface level, perhaps, but.
No, maybe it's what you said earlier. It's just, or maybe it's the same phenomenon looked at from a different perspective, right?
Very interesting.
Yeah.
What else, perhaps in terms of Lacan, you've often brought up the interesting thing that, you know, Lacan obviously being influenced by Hegel, but what sort of denying it, and that common refrain you have of when Lacan thinks he's being, he's not being Hegelian is when he's being the most, and the vice versa of that, which I think is interesting. Maybe if you don't mind going into that, or something interesting with Lacan and Hegel that you've enjoyed as well.
Sure. I think that that idea, so I think it's when, so Lacan thinks he's breaking from Hegel when he thinks he gives up the notion of recognition, that there can be, that the end of psychoanalysis is something like what he calls full speech or mutual. I think his idea is there's some kind of mutual recognition that's beyond struggle. And he gives that up, and it becomes more, you identify with the objet, so you identify with the detritus, the piece of you that's
discarded,
exiled. And it's interesting because I think that is the Hegelian idea, that you only, there's this great notion in Hegel that you find yourself, that you can only find yourself when you discover yourself in absolute otherness. So I think that is precisely what Lacan is getting at with his idea of identifying yourself with the objet as the end point of analysis. It's another way of saying that would be you find yourself in absolute otherness. So in this point where you're most estranged from yourself, that's where you really find yourself. That's Hegel's idea. And then I think that's also, that fits in so nicely, I think, with the way Lacan theorizes the end of analysis, starting in Seminar 11. I mean, it gets there preludes to it in Seminar 8 even, but it's this, see, to me, that's the great moment of Lacan's thought, that maybe from Seminar 10 to about Seminar 15, 16, like I think that middle period is really the most fecund, and I think it's also the most Hegelian, precisely because of that notion of the way analysis ends and the way that you get identified with the thing, with the piece of detritus.
Interesting. One thing I was going to ask you that I just recalled was, have you ever read the Dune series, the Frank Herbert sci-fi novels?
I've read the first one.
Just the first one. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something interesting that I was thinking about yesterday was, so later on in the books, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't spoil you, but
no, it's okay. I probably won't read them then. So
very interesting Hegelian and even I think Marxist way to read the series is, so eventually you have Paul Maudib. After the first book, this tremendous empire comes, and it's the jihad, and it's a slaughter across the galaxy or what have you. In the third book, Paul has a set of twins. One of them, Leto II, and he eventually merges with the sandworms of Dune somehow.
Oh, wow.
And so I was thinking about the issue, was like, okay, so he is becoming the one, he's merging with the other, and in some degree, or even possibly with death itself, to create this universal, like this sort of, because he becomes sort of this transcendent being, right, that incorporates humanity and the worm, or like I was thinking maybe the worm's, you would think death, right? So merging life and death into one sort of being, and then he enforces this golden path, which is almost like you might see as like a Marxist-Leninist or Maoist kind of takeover of like an authoritarian forcing of humanity to bend to his will, and through that authoritarianism, the human race benefits ultimately. Like there has to be this. Essentially, they want to do away with this idea of prescience and what have you, and have a humanity that where there are no prescient beings that can interfere and cause all these problems, which I think is a super fascinating way to read the series. But,
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I always thought that Dune, I thought it was an incredibly Hegelian moment where they say the worms are the spice. This notion that the things that would destroy us are also the source of the thing that we value the most. I think that's an incredibly Hegelian and Lacanian moment, right? Like this thing that we want to escape is actually the thing that we have to be drawn to at the same time. So, but I mean, I'm a little skeptical of this idea that we can get rid of certain kind of things that are damaging us. Like I mean, Hegel's idea, and I think the idea of psychoanalysis also is we have to instead like embrace the thing that damages us, and it's the attempt to create a world that doesn't have that, to make America great again, or whatever form that takes. That's actually the source of the greater problems, right? Like that it's the inability to put it in Hegel's words, to tarry with the negative. It's our inability to do that then produces the worst, I think. Right. So I think I really think that's an important idea. And I think when Marxism has forgotten that, it's gone incredibly awry, right? And the notion that we can produce a better society by killing a whole lot of people, that seems to me a terrible, Marx, I think, would have been appalled by that. And I think that but it's a product of this idea of we can improve people. And I think that both the psychoanalytic idea and the Hegelian idea is that you can't, all you can do is, as I said, like tarry with the negative parts of our existence and make do with them. Right. And so I think in a certain way that sounds cynical, but I think it's almost the opposite of cynicism, because I think it's a way to say that there's a political struggle at work, and it's how engaging in that struggle is what makes our life livable.
It's interesting to look at that in that context of June too, because you have Paul, who is trained as, he's trained in all these things as a fighter, as, in the Bene Gesserit tradition, as even like the mentat, like the human computer. So he has all this training to be this, this sort of singularity, this sort of messianic figure. But then as that happens, he's horrified by what becomes at that. And you see that really, this gets elucidated in the second book a lot more so, which is a very much it kind of definitely flips. There's a very much a contradiction between that first book and the second book, where you start to see the negative fallout of just kind of what you were describing, like sort of this horror of trying to enforce a different humanity. And so the son has to take up the work of the father, and then he actually, I think, tries to introduce a more Hegelian approach to it by trying to get rid of this sort of mechanistic, controlled aspect. Eventually, although he is utilizing sort of this authoritarian approach, because so as part of this, he becomes inhuman. He resembles a worm with a human face and lives something like 4,000 years. And even winds up engineering his own assassination. He sets in motion his own assassination as a way to bring about this new future or new potential for humanity, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, that just hit on me yesterday as I was talking with my roommate and thinking about Hegel and dialectics and trying to see those relationships, or maybe, having the toolkit now, or a more improved toolkit lately, I think, to approach things dialectically. It was really interesting too for me to go back and read Baudrillard after having a little bit more exposure to both Hegel and Marx, and being able to see some of the dialectical approaches that Baudrillard himself took. I thought that was
Especially early on,
yeah.
Right.
So yeah, symbolic exchange and death is where he kind of starts to break from Marx a bit, but he's still very much, whether he's acknowledging it not, oftentimes he is being very dialectical.
Right.
But that's all I had for today, Todd. Unless you had anything else to share.
No, Cooper, it was really great talking to you. I really had a great time.
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate your time. I do want to give you the opportunity to discuss what you and Ryan are doing at Y Theory, and you have a book out recently, right?
Well,
Or
my book,
out?
I think it's not quite out yet. Yeah, the book is called Universality and Identity Politics. Yeah, it's going to be out in a month or so.
Okay. We'll keep our eyes out for that. But definitely anybody who is interested in Hegel and psychoanalysis should definitely check out Todd and Ryan's podcast, Y Theory. They do a great job, I think, of introducing these things, and also discuss Freud and other thinkers. So I will absolutely put a link to the podcast in the show notes. But once again, this is Todd McGowan. Thanks much
Cooper,
for joining me on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. For my listeners, I do want to mention that you can find us on Twitter at UnconsciousHH, on Instagram as well at UnconsciousHH, and then once again on Patreon at patreon.com/MUHH. But this will be the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour signing off for the week. Cheers.
Hey, Cooper, thanks a lot. That was fun.
Hey, I appreciate it. That was awesome.
Including the ultimate form of singularity, which is against violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. And so on and so on. What I mean is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.